Hi there, this is Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. I'm Ian Willoughby. My guest this time out is the poet and veteran broadcaster Igor Pomerantsev. He's been living here in Prague since the mid-1990s, when his station, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, moved to the Czech capital. Born in Russia but raised in Ukraine, Mr. Pomerantsev left the USSR at the end of his 20s, after being accused of circulating anti-Soviet literature. He and his family later settled in London, where he worked for the Russian section of the BBC World Service. And I spoke to Igor Pomerantsev, who is today 76, at our studios in Vinohrady for this edition of Prague Talk. You were born in Russia but grew up in Ukraine. What were the circumstances of your departure from the Soviet Union in the second half of the 1970s?
Really, I was born in Russia, in Saratov. Saratov is a city on Volga River. And my Ukrainian friends say to me that it is the only black spot in my biography. But I have an alibi. My father was a military correspondent, so the family left one place for another place. And actually, I was brought up in Ukraine, and I freely speak Ukraine, and I freely read Ukrainian, but I write in Russian. In a way, in as if modern terms, I could say that I was the child of Russian imperialism because of mixture of languages, mixture of inner borders in the Soviet Union. So it was quite logic for me to be a kind of rolling stone, although the circumstances of my immigration in 1978 were, I would say, dramatic, because I faced bad relationship with KGB.
Because you were caught possessing or circulating anti-Soviet literature, is that the case?
Yes, it sounds very formal from law point of view, but in reality it means that as a young writer, I was interested to read any kind of literature, including forbidden. So we exchanged with my friends. It was not circulation, you see.
It wasn't some samizdat network or something.
It was samizdat, but samizdat you could touch with your hands. You could type even. So the word circulation would lead us far away from reality. Reality was that I was a young writer. I wanted to read, say, I was first in detention in 76 for a couple of books, and among it was Archipelago Gulag, but another was a novel by Vladimir Nabokov. So even Nabokov, a kind of artist of literature, was treated by KGB as a kind of illegal element. So circulation was simply my thirst for reading. And we left, my son was 10 months old only, and we left Kiev because I was very actively pushed. And here, there is a kind of nuance. It was possibly the first time in my biography when a great Russian literature helped me not to be arrested. Because in Kiev, if I could be accused in Ukrainian nationalism, they would tear me off. It's 7 years of a camp and 5 years of inner exile. But as far as I was a Russian writer, it was a kind of privilege. I don't know exactly, but I suspect that to arrest me, Kiev KGB had to ask permission in Moscow, and it was a kind of humiliation for them to ask a permission. So in a way, I left the Soviet Union almost against my will, but still choosing to be a hero dissident and a writer. I chose to be a writer.
Well, you left with your family for London, where you worked for the Russian section of the BBC World Service. How was that experience working for the BBC World Service?
Our first stop was in West Germany, but after been a year in Germany, I found a job in London at BBC because I graduated from the English department. So I was a perfect candidate for BBC, and they immediately took me. How was the job? It was a discovery of the world for me, the psychology, the politics of the world. I remember it's very end of 79, and the first job of mine was a translation of a feature about Daniel Defoe. And I was shocked because, we are in the middle of Cold War, propaganda war. And I'm asked to translate absolutely neutral and very simple feature about Daniel Defoe. I did it properly, but thanks to this feature, I understood what it means, multicultural and polyphony of voices, because I translated different people who took part in Daniel Defoe feature. They expressed their opinion. They were experts. There was one even child about Robinson Crusoe, I think, yeah. And thanks to this, from my point of view, senseless feature, I understood what polyphony of democracy is. And usually in the Soviet Union, radio gave monologues. And here I understood that the BBC is the embodiment of acoustic democracy. And it was a good lesson. Now, looking back, I should accept that Daniel Defoe helped me to understand what democracy is.
Also now, at this point, you have been working in radio for the best part of 45, 50 years. After the BBC World Service, you joined Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And when the station moved from Munich to Prague in the mid-90s, you also moved here to Prague. One time I met a Ukrainian guy who told me that his nation regarded the Czechs as Germans, but the more they drank, the more Slavic they become. How have you found living among the Czechs for the last 30 years almost?
You know, I traveled a lot after immigration, and it was not just an interest or curiosity. Later, I understood that it was a kind of neurosis because I needed to get used to break the state borders, because in the Soviet Union you can't go abroad. So for me, every time when I crossed state borders in Europe, I felt very nervous. So it was a kind of vaccination for geographical freedom for me. So I imagined a psychological map of Europe, Western Europe, quite well. I knew, for instance, that I like London because it's not aggressive. And I don't feel comfort in Paris because Paris is aggressive. So I came to Czech Republic and I felt relaxed because it's not aggressive at all. There is one more point which is very important for me. I was brought up in Chernivtsi. It's a former Austrian empire. And I studied at the university built by the project of Josef Hlavka, an Austrian Czech architect. And I came here and I live in Katarzyńska Street, not far from hospital for birth, as well projected by Josef Hlavka. So in a way, I am in the zone of nostalgic, retrospective, nostalgic Austrian Empire. And I tell you more, I projected to die in Trieste, because it's a good projection. I think Czernowitz, Austria, Prague, Austria, and to die on the beach in a former Austrian place, Trieste. But unfortunately, Brexit and personally Boris Johnson spoiled my death. I can't now live more than 180 days in European Union countries. And imagine, I go to Trieste, I have 180 days, but that's not enough for me to die. So I should go back somewhere in Prague or in London. I'm British, by the way. And again, so delaying my death. But Prague is my place in my retrospective nostalgia. This is, anyway, look, in Czernowitz is a small place, but it is one of the literary capitals of German-speaking world, because between two world wars, great Austrian German poets used to live there. The icon is Paul Celan, who later committed suicide in Paris. So for Czernowitz, as if was a kind of literary magnet for me. And 15 years ago, I was one of the founders. Actually, it was my idea to start a poetry festival in Czernowitz, to bring back poetry to Czernowitz, because it was a motherland of great poets.
And is it the case that you've also been holding this festival since the Russian full-scale invasion began? Is it still going on?
Yes, it's running, and Czernowitz is a kind of golden boy in a way, because it was never till now, cross my fingers, bombarded by Russians. Yes, we go on because poetry, usually in peaceful time, poetry is a kind of very small sect, and it has very small audience. But during wars, revolutions, poetry start playing another role, a public role. It's a spirit of resistance. It's a kind of ersatz of freedom, of resistance, of independence. So now I think even poetry in Czernowitz plays even more role during the war than before.
I wanted to ask you also, you're obviously a well-known poet as well as a broadcaster, and you write in Russian. If the Russian aggression towards Ukraine has impacted in some way your attitude to the Russian language?
It's a complicated question, by the way, and it has a ground, and I'm not unique. For instance, James Joyce, he was Irish, and his relationship with English was vulnerable. Actually, in his novel, A Portrait of an Artist in Young Years, there is even a passage when his hero speaks to a cleric, and cleric is English, and they discuss two words, very small, everyday, from everyday life, from something building, the tube in the building, how do you call it? And suddenly the hero feels the cleric is an owner of the English language, and he's secondary towards cleric. In the end of the novel, James Joyce is back to the issue, and his hero says, okay, but I will express my Irish soul and thirst for freedom in English. So my son is a British writer. He writes in English. And once in his essay, I read that he feels some burden, imperial burden of the English language, and he feels some responsibility. So this feeling is characteristic and natural for sensitive writers. I don't write detective stories or science fiction where the language is not important. But for me, yes, I have a tension in my relationship with my mother tongue. Actually, Russian is my mother tongue. But still, look, historical precedents show us that Nazis in Germany and great German writers, and they coexisted, but they coexisted in different cosmoses. So I live in another cosmos, but when I visit Ukraine, and already 15 festivals I run, and I took part as a poet, and mostly, especially last 3 years I perform in Ukrainian. Fortunately, my Ukrainian is enough good. But still, the war, the war bites everybody. And it's very painful, because to read my poems in Ukrainian translation, reading in Ukrainian translation, I feel that I don't enjoy it as much as I could reading in my mother tongue. But still, it's a gesture of solidarity with Ukraine, with Ukrainian language. And I'm so happy that in my childhood I studied Ukrainian, and I never avoided lessons of Ukrainian. And I read hundreds of adventurous, mostly books in Ukrainian, and I mastered my Ukrainian. So in my attitude, I was absolutely open. There was not a touch of Russian imperial attitude towards Ukraine or Ukrainian culture or Ukrainian language.
Well, the poor Ukrainian people look destined to lose a significant part of their territory. It's hard to imagine from today's perspective that that wouldn't happen. But looking to the future, do you think that other countries have a real reason to fear Russian expansionism?
Look, the question is more deep, more profound. There are cultures where death is prevailing. Russia is a champion of killing themselves and others. First of all, I speak about Gulag. We are speaking about millions victims, not outside, but inside. Plus, and I think almost nobody mentions it, in Russia there was a civil war after the so-called revolution, approximately between 1918 and 1921, 22, 23. It's not exact. You can't put a dot. And it's a unique war for Europe as well. Civil war, nearly 9 million people died, most of them civilians. It's a kind of public open suicide. So what I'm speaking about, that there are cultures where death is prevailing. For instance, Aztecs culture. It was based on blood and sacrifices of people. So if we speak about this from this metaphysical point of view, that Russia loves death, of course there are people who hate it. And by the way, the war between Russia and Ukraine is the war between death and thirst for life. And Ukrainians showed that they love life. One of Solzhenitsyn's novels is Cancer Ward. And in a way, it's a metaphor. And what is the logic nature of cancer? To live, it needs expansion, extend, takes new and new territories. So answering metaphysically to your political question, I would say that the cancer is eager to extend.
To end on a lighter note, you mentioned your son, Peter Pomerantsev. Your own father was a journalist. You, of course, are also a journalist. Peter is very successful with especially his books in recent years. Is it gratifying for you to see him doing so well in the family business?
You know, there was a tradition in Middle Ages of giving the profession in a family and taking the profession, possessing the profession. It was quite logic and it was rational. Now, in modern world, we don't have it, but in a way, genetically, it's still not often, but sometimes it works. Yes, my son, Peter, he is British writer. His mother tongue is English. And he writes non-fiction. And I think that he took lesson from me that poetry is hopeless. that if you write poems, you are doomed for a very narrow circle of readers. And he, although he is artistically sensitive, and in his non-fiction books, there are strong elements of fiction, history of the family, for instance, his memoirs about schools in England and in Munich. But still, he chose something much more practical than poetry. And every hour conversation by messenger, I remind him, Peter, please, at least sometimes read poems. Otherwise, your language and your non-fiction would be from veneer, half dead. So we have professional relationship, and in a way, I'm and my wife Lina, we are the first readers of his drafts of his books, and he appreciates our remarks and comments.
Just curious, do you speak English or Russian together?
His Russian is very good, very good. He worked in Moscow for a period of time, a long period of time at entertainment television. So his Russian is good. I remember he told me a story in Moscow. He got a wild taxi, and a driver spoke to him, and in the end, the driver said, "Oh, look, guy, you're not ours." And Peter thought, "Oh, God." He thinks that I'm a spy. And he said, "You are from Yaroslavl." Yaroslavl, you know, it's not far from Moscow. So yes, family, my middle-aged family functions simultaneously archaic and very modern, because in a way I write vers libre, so without rhyme, and it's till now a rare phenomenon in Russian literature, in Russian poetry, and I am presently 76, but paradoxically I am treated as an avant-gardist, and I know why, because I work in an archaic literature.
Many thanks indeed to Igor Pomerantsev, who I spoke to in November 2024 for Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. If you're new to the pod and enjoyed this conversation, there are well over 100 other editions out there. Why not give some of them a listen and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts? But that's all for now from me, Ian Willoughby. Thank you so much indeed for listening to Prague Talk, and talk to you again very soon.